Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Francisco Rivera wash processed Peru from Ceto Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Ceto, based out of Keyport, New Jersey. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having recently reviewed the Leo Taraga, a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. And in that review, I mentioned that I had a limited familiarity with this coffee roaster going into that review. And that is because I did receive a sample of this coffee from Airworks before Ceto won that Coffee of the Month poll. So when they would go on to win that poll, I did reach out to them asking them for some recommendations. And that is largely because I was hoping that they would suggest the Edwin Narenya cinnamon co-fermented coffee, as it would have made for a very good excuse to review that coffee, as well as review one of Ceto's washed and non-washed offerings. However, when they did suggest this coffee, I decided to take them up on that offer, largely because I already knew that I enjoyed this coffee and felt like it would make for an interesting review. So we'll go ahead and see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 55. And the recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which does indicate a more medium grind. Roast profile of this coffee, as mentioned in our previous Ceto review, Ceto does roast on the pretty light side of the spectrum, especially in comparison to the vast majority of American-based coffee roasters that we do review on this channel. And the comparison that we had in that review was that of Datura, as it is just a slight bit lighter than the experiences that we did have with Datura up to this point. And I can say that that was consistent with this coffee as well, as we will continue to align Ceto with being on the very light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 21, first impression through the V60, and the coffee is off to a mostly nice start, as it does have a slight marshmallow and vanilla-like sweetness to it, but it's generally pretty clean with plenty of florality in line with the listed lilac. Some lighter qualities, including a roasted tea aspect, as it felt like this coffee probably still needs some more time to settle, and that's also consistent with the other coffee that we did have from Ceto, as it certainly felt like that coffee needed even more rest than this one, as I had a much more positive first impression of this coffee than I did with the Leo Taraga. But one thing that is very interesting and worth noting within this coffee, it smells amazing. So the main reason why I was so intrigued by this coffee when a sample was offered to us from Airworks was because of just how pretty the coffee smelled. And when you are brewing the coffee, it just has such a lovely floral aroma to it. And for that reason, I was really hoping to get it to translate within the experience. And my assumption from this first try was that this coffee probably just needed more time to really bring out a lot of those floral qualities to it. Day 24 through the Chemex, and the coffee is even better today, as it's offering more of a citric grain sweetness that is reminiscent of Fruit Loops, but in a much more clean sense. And for somebody that loved Fruit Loops within coffees so much, a lot of those Diviso coffees have completely ruined that for me, because once upon a time, getting that characteristic in a coffee was a demonstration of an extremely clean experience, but now it's kind of concerning that it might be followed by something that is very unclean and unnatural to expect within a coffee. But this one was so clean and so nice that I was able to overlook and omit the, I want to say, trauma I've had from a lot of those El Diviso coffees, to the point where it was a very lovely floral forward experience on this one. More of the vanilla and marshmallow characteristics, as well as the citric qualities presenting in a sweeter scent. So this was another really lovely day of this coffee. I really enjoyed the first couple of impressions I did have, which going into this coffee, I was expecting to enjoy quite a bit. Day 27 to the UFO Brewer, and the coffee was a fair bit more toned down than some of the previous days, as there's a much more subtle presentation of the floral qualities. It opens up as it cools down, but this experience was a fair bit more generic than some of the earlier tries, so this one was just okay, not the best results within the UFO Brewer with this coffee roaster. Day 30 through the V60 with Ceto's recipe, 16.25:1 at 92 degrees Celsius. And while the coffee is still very nice, it did not have that same special cereal grain quality from the earlier days, as there's more of a vanilla marshmallow like sweeter sense to it, yet again with a very clean but softer citric quality to it. And that was kind of the struggle with this coffee. As I mentioned, it smells a lot prettier than I was able to get it to turn out most of the time. There were some days and experiences I had that were very in line with that aroma, but it wasn't always consistent, and toning this coffee down I don't think was the right direction to go with it, as on day 33 we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments and similar results, as it's still offering plenty of the listed floral and sugary qualities to it. There are some times throughout the experience where it's near Panamanian geisha-like in terms of the floral expression, most specifically in a vanilla-like sense. But for the most part, it's not always consistent within this coffee. I can safely say that for me, it was at the very best in those moments. Day 39 through the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, so 17-1 at 99 degrees Celsius. And there were definitely pros and cons of pushing this coffee, as it did feel like it helped with a little bit of the intensity and sweetness, offering a little bit more sugariness. But the delicate florals were a fair bit more absent this time around, as it's not necessarily the most abundant within this coffee, but they do present a little bit better as the coffee did cool down. So it felt a little separated, a lot of the best aspects of it right at the forefront, and then this kind of blank intermediary where the finish is offering a little bit more florality as it cools, but not necessarily as well layered and structured as I might have hoped for. Day 45 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this was one of the most tame and toned down representations that we had of this coffee. So this coffee was just a little inconsistent with how we brewed it. I can say that it felt a little bit temperamental. Any sort of adjustments did seem to yield some pretty significant results to it. This coffee also seemed to benefit from a more moderate recipe, which is consistent with the Leo Taraga that we worked with as well. And there's a soft sugariness in the finish once again, but overall it just felt a fair bit too soft in comparison to some of the earlier days. So on day 50, we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe. And in the same way that the Leo Taraga seemed to have a rejuvenation on our final time brewing it, that seemed to happen with this coffee as well, as it was definitely one of the better days that we'd experienced from it, as it does have a little bit more of a creamy texture to it, and that goes along the vanilla and marshmallow-like tones that we've mentioned up to this point. It's similar in a lot of ways to H&S's coffee, which is a huge compliment given that I still very much enjoy a lot of the ultralight offerings that H&S does release, especially after they have been well rested and you are able to get those coffees at its best. Florals very much in line with that listed lilac, which is something I've also experienced with a fair bit of H&S's coffees in a very pretty scent. So this coffee was turning out to be very pretty, and I even wrote on the notes that it is similar to some of the geishas. I'm not specifically saying Panamanian geishas, but also Ecuadorian geishas and other geishas that we've had from H&S in the past. So for that reason, I was very much enjoying the way that this coffee turned out. A little bit more of a citric sweetness, orange sweetness. I think they have tangerine listed on here in a cleaner sense. So very happy with this final day that we brewed this coffee. Here on day 55, brewing it the same way, I can say that there is another really nice experience to it yet again. All right, well, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick. The florality level 5. That in itself is a pretty big win. I mentioned that it does offer a lot of similarities to some of the H&S geishas that we've had on this channel, so that is easily going to be my favorite part of this coffee. I mentioned it sporadically throughout this review because in the same way that the coffee was inconsistent, the way that the florality was presenting was a little bit more inconsistent. By the end, I can't say that it did seem to dominate a lot of the experience that I did get from this coffee. So lilac note makes a lot of sense. I'm still thinking a little bit more along the lines of that vanilla at times as well. So very much enjoyed that part of this coffee. Let's go and move on to level 4, as we will start with the cleanliness. Level 4, very, very clean. So we are working with a Peruvian geisha. I fully expected it to be very clean, and I would say cleaner than the Leo Taraga as well. Better definition to a lot of the characteristics we experienced on this one. So very happy with that. Finish level 4. Finish is very pretty, especially given that it does a lot of the time come in that more floral sense. I can get a sugariness to it, which also does seem to help. So in addition to the florality being one of my favorite parts, I can say that having that accompanied by the very enjoyable finish to this coffee gave it just some more enjoyable characteristics. Sweetness level 4, definitely sweeter than the Leo Taraga, and I even mentioned that in the Leo Taraga review that I didn't want to bump that one up to level 4 because I don't think it would have done this coffee justice. This coffee's on the higher side of level 4, much more justified on this one. They do have a sugar note listed on here, and I can definitely see that given the very strong sweetness of this coffee. So happy with that on this one. It's always interesting to me when we have these very light profiled coffees that do present that enjoyable sugariness. It's a pretty good chance that I'm going to enjoy the coffee quite a bit then. Citrus fruit level 4. They do have a tangerine note listed on here if I remember correctly. I think the notes are lilac, tangerine, and then that sugar note, but citrus makes a lot of sense, especially given that it does present in that sweeter sense. Now that I'm thinking about it, there are definitely coffees we've had from H&S that have had similar notes to it, and that might explain why I saw a lot of similarities to H&S's Gesha coffees with this one too. Let's go and move on to the level 3s. We will start with the acidity level 3. Not the brightest coffee, and comparing it alongside of the Leo Taraga, I did brew these coffees every single day side by side and then made the tasting wheels at the same time. So that really stood out in terms of the sweetness and acidity for the both of them, as this one was a little bit lower than that coffee, and we opted to put that there at the level 3. Don't think that this one ever intended to be higher than that regardless. Berry fruit level 3, I didn't write it down in the notes, but as I was drinking this coffee and as I was thinking about it, there is a little bit of a lychee-like characteristic to it, but not in a fermenty sense. Usually when I do get lychee in coffee, it's in a very negative tone, but within this coffee, it presented a little bit more like a lychee gummy, which when it does, I do enjoy it a lot more in the coffee itself. So I can see that a slight more red fruit characteristic at times, but in a much cleaner sense, as usually red fruit indicates not overly clean. Body level 3, that's the last thing worth discussing on this one. As I mentioned, there's a little bit more of a creamy body to it, which Peruvian Gesha still wash processed coffee, I think you'd probably expect it to be a little lower, but making the tasting wheel alongside the Leo Taraga, I just noticed a fair bit more body to this coffee than that one, so we bumped it up a little bit higher at that level 3 mark. Outside of that though, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. The very first time I brewed that sample, I knew I had something very enjoyable on my hands, and I honestly thought that if we had an opportunity to work with a full bag, then I would enjoy it even more than that sample. But what I noticed about this coffee was just how temperamental it was, just how inconsistent it was. But at its very best, it's a very enjoyable coffee. The aroma itself is just so pretty and beautiful that my biggest goal was to just continue to replicate that over and over. However, it wasn't that simple, as this coffee just didn't really seem to work well with a lot of the adjustments that we did make over time. And it's always frustrating when you go through an entire cycle of trying out all these different recipes and different ways to brew this coffee, only for you to realize that what you had at the start was probably the best representation you were going to get. The first time I ever brewed this coffee, I would say that it was just as good, if not better, than a lot of the experiences that I did have trying out this entire bag of this coffee. Even then, the highs of this one are extremely high, and the lows are still pretty high. I mean, my least favorite experience of this coffee, probably the UFO Brewer Day, was still a very enjoyable experience of this one, largely because it offered everything I was looking for. Great cleanliness, excellent cleanliness, I should say. A very high level of florality, plenty of fruit characteristics to it, and plenty of sweetness. So the big four that I'm looking for, all checked within this coffee. So I would say that easily my favorite of the coffees that we've tried from Ceto up to this point, and one of the more enjoyable Peruvian Geshas. Is I've honestly had some mixed impressions with Peruvian Geshas, but I found this one to be very enjoyable. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you do enjoy those very abundant floral qualities to it in a much more clean sense with a lighter profile, this one's a very good fit for you. Also keep in mind the sweetness being on the higher side of things. I mean, these are all things that I very much look for within a coffee, so I imagine it's something that a lot of people seek as well. Not going to be the brightest. A fair bit of body does add for a little bit of interesting depth to this one, and then a slightly more citric but sweeter citric forward experience. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Francisco Rivera wash processed Peru from Ceto Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.